space. One of the things that I find really exciting about this idea is that the same logic applies to space. Right now, space has a very high barrier to entry, but technology is bringing that down. And this whole mobility argument that I made about the ocean, where we can just switch countries really easily, it applies even more to space. You can move huge things around really, really cheaply. So the way I look at it is, you know, we built our civilization in the place that it was easiest at the beginning, and you know, we kind of screwed up. And maybe it was the best at the beginning, but the static arrangement of different countries has kind of trapped us. And with this static arrangement, centralized power tends to spread itself out and control things. But 68% of the Earth's surface is the oceans, and almost all of the universe has this quality of greater mobility. So, you know, we built our civilization so far in the wrong place, but most of the world has the right characteristics for a free, dynamic society. All right, before I talk about the things that my organization is doing to try to bring this ambitious goal to reality, I just want to talk about libertarianism and kind of normal libertarian activism and how it's different from this. So this set of answers is very different from the ones that I think most libertarians use. A question that I often use with non-libertarian groups is I say, why do we get better service at Starbucks than the DMV? Which in the US is the department that licenses your cars and says who can drive cars. Long lines, bad service. And a libertarian, if I pose this question, will just say, well, of course it's obvious. You know, Starbucks serves coffee, it's owned by an entrepreneur, he has profit or loss. The government employees at the DMV, they have no personal profit. But that's not the answer, I think. That's not the end of the answer. It's true, but it's incomplete. Why, I want to know, why do we have a good set of incentives at Starbucks? And why do we have a bad set of incentives for the government? I mean, after all, in a libertarian world, you know, one answer that libertarians might give is because the government uses force. Very standard answer. And therefore, bad things happen. But that's just not the answer. In a libertarian world, Starbucks might have a sign above the door that says, we, Starbucks, have a monopoly on the use of force inside this Starbucks. If you enter, you consent. They could do that, but I predict that if that happened, when people walked into Starbucks, the person serving coffee would not ask you to fill out a form stating your income for the year and ask you for part of it. Why? Because nobody would go to that Starbucks. And if every single Starbucks did this, someone would start a new one that just sold the damn coffee and didn't ask you what your income was or try to take some of it. So I hope to convince libertarians that even though incentives matter, that we often look at things at the wrong level. And we have to push our analysis up to these root causes. Why is the bad incentive structure in place? Now, if markets are the answer, if we need more competition between governments and more innovation in governments, and we love markets, why is it that libertarians don't come up with this answer very often? And my belief is that it comes from our past in small hunter-gatherer tribes, like many of our the different mistakes that we consistently make. Tens of thousands of years ago, if we were sitting around the fire saying, you know, how should we divide up the buffalo meat, or where should we move for the summer, the way to change what the tribe did was to come up with a good idea, to articulate it persuasively, to go talk to some individuals and build a coalition of people around this idea. And in a group of 100 people, an individual can do this and change what the tribe does. But what works for 100 people doesn't necessarily work for 100 million. We have these same instincts that each of us has a voice in politics as big as a member of a 100-person tribe. So we comment on nationwide events that we have no influence over with this passion as if we were part of the tribe making the decision, even if nobody is listening. This, by the way, is my explanation for why there are so many blogs. So we have to move beyond this kind of intuitive activism that says politics is the process of reaching people individually and changing their minds and building coalitions. I mean, think about it. If somebody just said to you, okay, there's some industry and it's got a monopoly provider, which makes a really bad product. Here's 2 ways you could fix it. You could fill out their customer surveys and say how crappy they are. You could write a lot of letters to their customer service department. You could try to form a group of reformers and agitate for the monopoly to do a better job. Or you could compete with the monopoly. I think a libertarian every time would say, well, of course, competition is better. So why is it that we don't compete with governments? I mean, I think part of the reason is that complaining is a lot easier. It's a lot easier. But do we want to do what's easy, or do we want to do what works? I mean, I kind of think of my mission as kind of like convincing people to stop looking for the fountain of youth and start doing anti-aging scientific research as a way of extending lifespan. It doesn't make it easy, at least it makes it possible. Unfortunately, libertarians tend to see the way to reform as being convince everyone of libertarianism. And it makes me very frustrated. This is kind of how I feel about this. Yes, it's very sad. And maybe this is a hard message to sell right now when libertarian groups are increasing in popularity. I mean, Ron Paul was this huge force for the libertarian movement in the US. But even though he did far better than libertarians have seen for a long time, he got 5.5% of the popular vote in the primary and ended up with 15 delegates, less than 1% of the total. Now, some people say, okay, but it's a great start. We just have to try harder and speak louder. Unfortunately, studies suggest that there's actually a libertarian personality. So David Nolan, who created the Nolan chart here, says that maybe 16%, 1/6 of the people are natural libertarians. Other studies using more restrictive definitions, like from David Bowes from the Cato Institute, say maybe it's 6% of people. And you might think that you can convince people that your morality is right, that freedom is correct. But the latest psychological research on morality from people like Jonathan Haidt suggests that morality is actually this kind of innate thing, that people have snap moral answers, and that all of the logic they make about moral rules is just made up after the fact to justify their snap answer. So there are definitely people that you can convert to libertarianism by arguing with them, but I think it's a very limited number of people. And when libertarianism spreads, I think that most of what's happening is not convincing people, but people who had not identified before as libertarian kind of realizing that there's this whole coherent philosophy and that there's evidence and there's groups of people for this way that they felt before and identifying with this group. And that's really valuable. That's really important, but it's not enough. But actually, I'll give you another argument and say it's even worse. Even if we could convince many people to be libertarians, we still would not win elections. H.L. Mencken has this great quote, "Every election is a sort of advance auction sale of stolen goods." And that's the sort of structural model of democracy. In the old model, it's like democracy is about giving people what they want. And you change what people want, and democracy will give them different things. But in this Mencken view, democracy, the people who compete in elections, the resources that they use to compete are those that they're going to seize control of if they win. So people who will use the resources and hand them out to their friends end up with many more friends, end up with many more supporters. So even if we convince many libertarians, libertarians not only are a minority, but they underperform their numbers in elections because they're not promising to give out goodies. There's a strong overlap between libertarianism and academia. And I think that's part of why there's a bias that says we just have to be right. We have to understand the world, we have to be right, we have to explain it, and that's enough. But politics is not a mechanism for discovering the truth and turning it into law. And so what we need is better mechanisms. What we need is more examples. of free societies to convince people, and ways that the people who are already convinced can go have a free society, not more papers and research. I mean, if you write the 532nd paper about Austrian business cycle theory, nobody's going to read it but the Austrians. If you go and create a society with 10,000 people that uses a different financial system and that has a stable economy over a long period of time with no booms and busts, the whole world will listen. Yes, this is much, much harder, but it can actually work. There's a classic economic mistake, which is to think that you can set prices with no consequence, to not understand that prices emerge from the intersection of supply and demand, that they're the result of human action, not human design. Well, in my view of things, when someone proposes a better law or a better policy, they're kind of policy fixing, like price fixing. They're making the same mistake. They're assuming we don't have a good law because the government doesn't have enough economists on staff, or because nobody's suggested a really great way to achieve these stated goals. The problem is, democracy is not a machine for spitting out good policies. There are underlying incentives, like the rewarding of special interests that I mentioned, that make government pass bad laws. We have to change the incentives if we're going to change this. There's a lot of divisiveness in the libertarian movement considering how small it is. I've heard anarchists say, you know what, we can't cooperate with minarchists. Because at the end of the day, if they get a minarchy, if they get a small state and we want to have our anarchy, they're going to be pointing guns at our head and saying, you got to use our small central government. But the idea of seasteading, the idea that groups should be free to band together in voluntary communities to try out new systems, is truly big tent, right? We can all agree that this would be a good thing. Even communists can agree that this would be a good thing. Because, hey, they think that their system would work great and that they'll be able to get lots of people to come do it. We think that our system would be great. We get lots of people to come do it. We can all agree. More experimentation, more political autonomy is a good thing. I have a little bit of family history in this world of politics and political activism. This is a quote that Brian Doherty wrote about my grandfather Milton, that the beauty of America is, may I advocate classical liberal limited government so that my son, who's here, David, may advocate anarcho-capitalism, and that my grandson, myself, may plan to build new artificial countries in the ocean. And I think that there's some real truth to this as a series of evolved ideas, where we all want the same thing but are trying different strategies. So my grandfather talked a lot about policies, right? Here is a good policy, and let me persuasively try to argue why this is a good policy. He changed many people's minds and still continues to do so, but we still have big government. Maybe he slowed the growth, but it still growed. My dad said, maybe the problem comes from the incentives, not from people's beliefs. And he'll be speaking at 6:30 about a different system than democracy, called anarcho-capitalism, and why its incentives might produce better laws. Now I come along and say, great, I'm convinced. This anarcho-capitalism thing sounds like a great idea. Why are great ideas for new systems of government not being tried? How can we change the world so that these great ideas can be tried? Now, given that I'm talking about the problems with organizing into political groups to try to change things, I want to clarify that I'm not saying libertarians shouldn't organize and network and try to convince people of our goals. I'm only saying that that's not enough.